Great, thank you for having me. Such a pleasure to be here. I've mostly shared about our work in Oregon and a little bit in Washington, but this is my first time sharing about it in this part of the country. So, pleasure to be here. So yeah, I'm going to give you an overview of some of the work we've been doing with dry farming in Western Oregon and Western Washington for the past few years. A little bit, I'll give you an overview of the practices and even share some of the results that we're starting to see in some of our trials. So just an introduction to how I even came into this topic. I work for the Extension Service in Benton County, so in the southern Willamette Valley of Western Oregon. And the most common question, I've been in my job for about 7 years, I realized pretty quickly that the most common question we get is, I just moved onto this piece of property and we're trying to decide what to grow here. So we talk about water rights, soil type, and oftentimes, traditionally, people are recommending, if you don't have water rights, to livestock or pasture. But people weren't talking about fruit and vegetable crops at that time. And then climate change. We are seeing a lot less snowpack in the mountains in our winters since the winters are warmer, and that definitely impacts irrigation. In 2015, we had a big drought in the West, and some vegetable growers that are used to irrigating throughout the growing season had their irrigation cut off as early as June. So that was a big eye-opener. So even growers that do have water rights were seriously considering what are our alternatives here. And in addition to that, many new farmers, we work a lot with beginning farmers in our small farms program, and new farmers have trouble accessing, it's not affordable really, class 1 soil with water rights. So oftentimes the new and beginning farmers we're working with are on land without water, limited water availability. So. And then in an urban setting, there are quite a few urban farms in Oregon and on the West Coast, and water is really expensive. A lot of home gardeners are even really interested in this topic, but it looks a lot different on a field scale than it does on a garden scale. This is a video, I won't have time to show it to you today, but it's a brief video that Washington State University did with us. Just it highlights some of the farmers that have been involved in our project and why they're involved in it. So if you get on YouTube, you can search dry farming and Amy Garrett, and you're welcome to watch this on your own time, but it gives a nice overview. So what is dry farming? What am I really talking about here? A lot of people say, oh, so you're growing without water? It's like, no, we can't grow anything without water. But we're referring to crop production during a dry season, like our summers in the Willamette Valley and Northern California, the Mediterranean, so where we have 40 inches of annual rainfall in our area, but it all happens October through May. So June through September, we maybe see 1 inch of rain that whole season, and that's when we're growing our crops like tomatoes, potatoes, squash, melons. So we're utilizing residual moisture in the soil from the rainy season instead of relying on supplemental irrigation. And I'll talk in a minute about what practices support that. This just highlights some other areas in the world that have a climate like we have in Western Oregon and Washington, that maritime climate. So there's some areas of Chile and different parts of Europe, little corners of Australia, but I think a lot of is anybody here from the Pacific Northwest? Okay, so there's a few of you, but a lot of us are in very different climates, and so just keep that in mind, is that I'm referring to our work in this climate. So some of it might be translatable to other areas, but I haven't applied this outside of the Pacific Northwest. Some of the resources I found when I first started digging into this topic were Steve Solomon has written a bit about dry farming techniques. Carol Deppe has a book called The Resilient Gardener, where she starts talking about some different strategies for dry farming. David Granitstein is a WSU extension professional that did a non-technical overview of dryland farming in the Pacific Northwest, but he was referring mostly talking about grain crops east of the Cascades, and most of the work I've been doing is west of the Cascades, so much more rainfall, much different soil, a lot different than what we normally read about when we read about dryland farming in our area. And then there's a big gap when I was doing research, and then 1920s, then you'll start to find some more information about dry farming. So John Witsoe is another book I came across when I did this initial research. And then I met farmers. So the work to date involves some case studies in Western Oregon and Northern California. I met an older farmer in his 70s, and this was really how I kind of got really interested in the topic. Was he had been dry farming a variety of fruit and vegetable crops for 40 years without any supplemental irrigation. So tomatoes, potatoes, squash, melon, dry beans. So I started documenting, visiting him once a month and documenting what his practices were, where he was at in the process, what crops he was growing. And then I went down to Northern California with some professional development funds, a little handful of money, and I rented a van and went down there and visited with 6 other farms and kind of documented what they were growing and how they were doing things. And then I did a demonstration. That first year was the drought year. I didn't know it was going to be a drought year when I did a dry farming demonstration. I was kind of worried about how it was going to go. We had thought maybe 20 or 30 people would show up to that field day, but in the drought year, and it was August 3rd, we had crops in the ground that hadn't seen any irrigation since, just from the rainfall. They were not irrigated in the field at all, and we had more than 100 people show up to that field day, so the project really gained momentum then. We did side-by-side tastings. You can see up here, this is like tasting table where we did dry farmed and irrigated taste comparisons with tomatoes and melons side by side. We started to collect some preliminary yield data. A lot of our funding was not research oriented, it was outreach and education. So I was doing mostly demonstrations when I started off on this project. And then we got some grant funding from Western SARE to do this Growing Resilience Water Management Workshop series. So we started holding field days. And then started engaging growers. There was a lot of growers interested in experimenting on their own, so we started to get into this participatory research, which is where we've been focusing for the past couple of years. So the Dry Farming Collaborative, I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So how does dry farming work? I got a couple slides here to just kind of give you like some of the basics. It really starts with the soil. So soil is so important. So many people that are involved in dry farming are very passionate about soil quality. So cover cropping, manure, compost, any sort of organic matter additions. But soils typically have some clay content, not heavy, dense clays, but the clay and the organic matter really impact water holding capacity, and they're not doing dry farming on on gravel or sand, right? There's usually 4 feet of soil or more, and the soil has good water holding characteristics, which we have a lot of soils like that in the Willamette Valley. And then when selecting a site, some people are on, like 50 acres, really kind of assessing the landscape using plants as indicators, like where in August is the landscape still lush and green, or where are the blackberries like extra plump and juicy. The web soil survey is another tool that we can use. This is a little snippet from that dry farmer that I mentioned in his 70s that I'd visited with initially. This is the soil that he was dry farming on, so plenty of rainfall, as you can see, 40 to 60 inches a year. When you get into the typical soil profile, you can see below that top foot there's clay content, so it's like clay loam and clay down there. Depth to restrictive feature, more than 80 inches, so he has more than 6 feet of soil that he's working with. And depth to water table, 36 to 72 inches. Some of the dry farm sites that we've seen, we pull a soil core, so this is a soil auger here at the bottom. And we've been pulling 5-foot soil cores at each site, because you don't really learn much about a site for dry farming by pulling off a 1-foot soil sample. You really want to know what's happening deeper, because the crops are rooting much deeper. So, but we've seen the water table be 2 or 3 feet down when we get ready to plant in May. So a 5-foot soil core can be very, give you a lot of information. Soil preparation timing, so we're starting as early as possible. Right now we're kind of dancing with the rain, so we haven't been able to start in the field in our area yet. We did think we were going to get in the field, so we flail mowed the cover crop to help it dry out a little faster, so maybe we could incorporate it, but we're still not there yet. So it's definitely, you want to start as early as possible, not like wait for the soil to dry out, like go on vacation, come back end of May and think about planting. We're going to be trying to plant at the beginning of May, or as soon as a window will allow us to do that. We'll of course let our cover crop sit for a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks after that, then we would be planting. So planting technique, planting when and where there is moisture. So after you cultivate, maybe you'll see like the top inch or two be pretty dry, and then just below that there's moisture. We're putting the seed in contact with that moist layer of soil. So sometimes that might be a little deeper than you're used to planting, so maybe 2 or 3 inches versus like an inch deep. And then a lot of dry farmers I visited with, well, they're increased plant spacing. So spacing plants out a little bit further, and how dense your planting is will vary from site to site and the water holding characteristics. Also pressing the soil around the seed or transplant. So that creates capillary action and brings moisture to the surface. Maybe you've walked across a cultivated field that looks pretty dry and then look back at your footprints and notice that your footprints are wet. So that's just an illustration of capillarity. So just around that seed or transplant, compressing that soil around there. Carol Deppe recommends pre-soaking all the big seeded crops. So like the squash, the melon, pre-soaking those for 24 hours. Surface protection, growers are experimenting with a lot of different things. The most conventional, traditional way of dry farming is really not a whole lot different than what organic farmers already do, which is cultivate to manage weeds versus apply herbicides. They're just being way more intentional about the timing. So whenever you have a rain event that compacts the surface, and you might see it start to crack when it dries out, especially in soils that have clay content, that crusting and cracking causes the soil to dry out faster. So then going back out there and just loosening the surface again. So creating this dirt or dust mulch is what field scale dry farmers are doing. This is just a stylized illustration by Moria Peters, illustrating kind of that difference in capillarity. So we're not seeing a lot of dry farming on sandy soils. There might be some unique sites that have extremely high water tables, like Shively, Oregon, Shively, California. It's in Humboldt County. They had 30 feet of topsoil deposited in the 64 floods. And it's on a riverbed, and there are a few dry farmers in that area. So they do have some sandy soils, sandy silty, but they have a water table that's right below that. But most of the soils that we're working on are a loam or clay loam or silty clay loam. These are the crops that we're typically working with. Notice like lettuce and broccoli aren't on the list here for dry farming. We're not that couldn't happen. There are, that site that I mentioned in Shively, there are people dry farming kale and eggplants and broccoli and some other things there. So, but these are typically the crops that we're working with. This is just an illustration of one of the demonstration we had in 2016. So there's 4 different treatments here. This is irrigated, low irrigation, and dry farmed. And this is a dry farm bed with a biochar compost. And it just kind of shows, so that this is mid-July. That first one was mid-June. And the plants are filling out. And then here we are in August. And you can see when you look at the plots, we were astonished at how similar they looked. So these all have the same plant spacing. They're pretty wide plant spacing. But we did see some difference in the varieties. So it's melons in the foreground, and then tomatoes, winter squash, and then potatoes in the back. So it's the same crops and varieties in each plot. And this is just a little snapshot of the winter squash varieties. You can see we have, this is the Stella Blue and then the Zeppelin Delicata. So the red and the green bar here are the dry farm treatments, and the blue and the purple bar are the irrigated treatments. So you can see right away that Stella Blue had a much higher yield. Stella Blue is a dry farm variety. It came from a dry farm plant breeder in Northern California. So he'd been selecting and developing and saving seed from this variety from a dry farm system. So Zeppelin Delicata is a really popular variety with growers in our area, but it obviously doesn't yield nearly as much when dry farmed. So we started to notice varieties, a difference in varieties right away, and wanted to dive into this a little further. Dark Star Zucchini is another really unique plant that was developed by that same plant breeder. Some pictures of it in Corvallis. In that drought year, I direct seeded it in May, early May, mid-May. And it started producing in July. You can see a little picture of we started to harvest here. But it cranked out zucchini until late September without any irrigation. And when the other types of squash were wilting on our very, very hot days, This one didn't even wilt, and I was started to be really intrigued by these varieties that came from the dry farm plant breeder, and thinking this would be a really valuable tool if we're going to be moving forward with this. This is a trial at a Gathering Together farm. So this is that 5-foot soil core, and this is a farm where that water table was just 3 feet below the soil surface. So we were planting tomatoes here in that picture. We just planted those, and the water table was just, after we pulled the core out, you could see that the water table was just right below. So those tomatoes were planted a foot deep and tapping in. They were only 2 feet away from the water table at that point. So this is the early, mid, and late season photo of their dry farm plot. And this is a farm that had water rights, but the dry farm tomatoes are the customers got really excited about them. So they started to expand upon their dry farmed tomato plot this past year and the year before, they're going to this year and they did last year, because of this niche marketing opportunity. So they have plenty of irrigation, they have senior water rights, but this is an example of a farm that's dry farming for this niche marketing opportunity. So as we start to, this is a list of farms that dry farmed in 2016. And this is also, so Herb Huddleston has an extension publication on soil productivity ratings in the Willamette Valley. So he's taken all the soil, his life's work. So this was from 1983, I think is the year on Herb Huddleston's work. But he assigned productivity ratings with all the soils in the Willamette Valley. So here we have soil types here on this column, native productivity, and then we have dryland productivity. So each one of these farms has a different dryland productivity rating. So we started thinking about, when we think about site assessment and selection for dry farming, maybe we can use these productivity ratings and correlate them with yield. So if people are calling in and saying, hey, I'm thinking about trying dry farming here, I don't have water rights. And we could say, well, it looks like you are pretty well suited for that or not. So this is what we're trying to develop decision-making tools around this. So here's an example from 2016 where we took our yield data and just looked at, this is our marketable yield here on the left, and its yield on the y-axis, and then these different varieties we grew on the x-axis. But notice these bars are very small, this yield is very small, much larger down here, as are these productivity ratings. So we got 73 for a dryland productivity rating here, and then we have 80, approximately 80 here below. So we want to dig a little further into this. So the Dry Farming Collaborative, this list of growers on the last slide, and a growing number of growers working with us. We are not just growers, we're also extension educators, plant breeders, and agricultural professionals partnering to increase knowledge and awareness of these management practices that support dry farming, but with a very hands-on participatory approach. So last year we had 30 trial hosts. This year I think we have 33. We started off just at the early 2016. I think I initiated our Facebook group in February of 2016. And now we have 450 members. The email list has about 120. So we use the email list to do internal coordination of our field trials. The Facebook group is more a window in on the project. So anybody interested in dry farming, learning from the growers are really sharing a lot, even doing like walkthroughs and videos of their plots and asking questions, having discussions. So we've done some different data collection on these sites. I've mentioned the soil cores. We've also done some collected yield data. We're going to be doing soil moisture monitoring this year. We've got a risk management education grant with Alex Stone. She's the vegetable cropping system specialist at Oregon State University. To start looking at, we're going to be installing moisture sensors at 5 depths at 33 different farms to look at site assessment for dry farming. Collecting yield data, and again, like so even if somebody doesn't ever intend to dry farm, doing these tastings, like we've been doing them at different events, so starting to build the market or the consumer base. So if people start seeing dry farm tomatoes at the farmer's market and they cost 50 cents or $1 more, they have had an experience. They're like, okay, like I do want to support that farmer, even though they're getting less yield. I would like to, these are really tasty tomatoes. So trying to help the farmers kind of raise awareness by doing that at these field days. And a lot of, I don't have any of the farmers working with me at this presentation because we're kind of far away from Oregon now, but oftentimes farmers will accompany me and share their experience at conference presentations as well. So this is kind of what we've been working on. The map there kind of shows kind of how we're distributed. We have a few more farms in Washington this year, and, but we're all throughout Western Oregon. So we, our experimental design in this, we've been doing variety trials. So to explore deeper what crops and varieties are suitable for dry farming. We started doing variety trials. We did a mother-daughter trial design, which is kind of a funny name, but we had 5 to 8 varieties of each crops, and then we would have a researcher-managed trial, which I and a gal working with me, Anna Duncan, we managed that plot. And then the farmers would choose which crops and varieties they wanted to grow, and they would serve as replicates. We designed this to be small so we could be inclusive of growers on all scales. These are the varieties that we included in our trials last year. So, and then the ones highlighted in yellow, we narrowed down our list a little bit due to space restrictions and funding limitations this year. So we just did 3 varieties of each crop this year. So, so those are the crops we grew. And this is an example of what our kind of mother plot looked like. So each one of these squares represents a different variety. We had the tomato block, the melon block, winter squash, zucchini, dry beans, and we had them randomized in between. So this is an example of what the tomato, one of these little blocks of tomato looked like. So there were 6 tomato plants in there. And then, so if a grower wanted to host just one replication of tomato, they could do that on 100 square feet. So we wanted to be inclusive. And this is an example of what the squash and melon, one of these squash and melon plots would look like. Just 3 plants. So we kind of tried to be uniform in our planting density, although people experimented with planting density as well. When we started to do some analyzing of this data, there is a data analyst working with us on this because it gets really complex. We had five of the farms collected data on 11 different tomato varieties. So we had our 6 varieties that we were replicating, but then there was some additional varieties that they wanted to try. So we had an unbalanced design. It's difficult to fit that to a statistical model. So not all the farms grew all the varieties. We ended up using the random effects for the statistical model were genotype by environment, and the fixed effects were plant density and available water holding capacity. So without getting into that too much, because I think people glaze over, including myself, when you get too far into this part. But results suggested this year from just our preliminary data, we've been doing this research for 1 year, this part, density effect of about 3 pounds per plant. So p-value of 0.14, so a little bit of a plant density effect, not really significant, but that lower p-value on available water holding capacity, of course, p of 0.06, suggests an extra inch of water holding capacity in the soil is worth a couple, there's a spelling error there, a couple thousand pounds per acre of yield. So of course, we would suspect plant density and water holding capacity to impact yield. When we look at variety differences, I have this is the squash. So that variety I showed you initially, Stella Blue, definitely performed, yielded more than, for example, Little Gem and Lower Salmon River. So we're starting to try where we have enough data. So a lot of farmers really intended to collect data, and then at the end of in the growing season and the busy craziness of it all, they just weren't able to do it. So counting and weighing produce when you're trying to get your product to market obviously is challenging. So we're doing this on a shoestring budget, and we're not going out and collecting the data. The farmers here are collecting the data. So we were able to make this graph and make this statement that yes, Stella Blue did perform better than Little Gem and Lower Salmon River on the sites that collected data.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Oh yeah, this is recorded, so they want to capture your question. So we can, I'd be happy to answer that. And this is an example of a farmer, like we weren't doing a density trial, but a farmer on his own did a density trial. So he had 3 different planting densities for his big beef tomatoes. And on his soil type saw with increased number of plants per acre and increase in yield. So we always talk about like having less plants per acre in dry farming, but he was seeing an increase in yield. So farmers are experimenting on their own. And it's really this collaborative learning and sharing of information, I think that's really valuable. And if we can start start to get some good data and figure out how to effectively do participatory research with growers this way, I think we already are learning a lot together. This is the tomato. So we have the different varieties of tomato here that we grew last year, and this is yield again. So early girl, this is a F2 early girl that a farmer, early girl is a hybrid tomato, but a farmer that is in our dry farming collaborative saved seed from her dry farmed early girls, and then we grew that out. So just wanted to tell you what that, and that's supposed to be a 2, not an @ sign, but so early girl definitely performed well. It's one of the most commonly dry farmed tomatoes in California, so we were just following the lead of what are the growers that are dry farming using. And so we saw the early girl and the stupichke, like people call this variety so many different things, stupichka, stupis, a perfect rogue. So these varieties, these were all, by the way, like the varieties that we chose were grower selected and ones that in the dry farming collaborative, the ones that they were interested in, but also ones that had been dry farmed before. So we can see some variety effects here. So this is what the question we're trying to answer is what crops and varieties do well in our area when dry farmed? Another thing that we looked at was grafted tomatoes. So that was an interest to the dry farming collaborative. Like what grafted tomatoes, they're really expensive, but would it make a difference dry farming? So each one of these bars, by the way, this is not a replicated research trial. Each one of these represents the yield of 5 plants. So, but you can see, all right, so this is dry farmed, and this is dry farmed grafted. We got irrigated and irrigated grafted. So then this is 3 different varieties. And you can see that when you look at dry and irrigated, obviously the irrigated is anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 more yield with each of these. But then when you look at dry grafted and irrigated, here the blue bar and the brown bar and the blue bar next to each other, the dry farmed grafted tomato yields more than the irrigated standard tomato in every variety. So we see a lot of potential here. There are a lot of farms in Oregon that are grafting tomatoes to manage disease, like they're planting tomatoes in the same high tunnel every year. And so farmers that are already set up to do grafting, this could be a very viable option. It'd be a great grad student project if you know of anybody interested. So our next steps in this project are developing our website to be more of a resource hub. Right now, just like when I started off on this project, there was information scattered about, and I found a little bit here and there and went out and talked to people, but there wasn't really a great resource hub, and I was really digging to find information. So we'd like to make the information from our project and these other resources out there more available on our website. I'm initiating a dry farming extension publication series. We'll start releasing that later this year. I've started on Intro to Dry Farming, and we're still gathering data for the site assessment and selection, doing some case studies with dry farmers, and then once we have a second year of data from these variety trials, we'll publish a report on that as well. And really just continuing to build this network of growers. It's this collaborative learning. We're learning so much together. We're expanding our drought mitigation toolbox together. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Not what works on our site may not work on another farm site. So it's really a toolbox, and people can kind of pick and choose from and adapt and learn together. If I was doing this research isolated on my own, we wouldn't be learning nearly as much. It's having this engaged group of growers also experimenting and sharing that is helping us learn a lot quickly. Some topics of interest that I mentioned: participatory plant breeding. This is, we want to develop more dry farm varieties for our region. So there's several plant breeders in the group that are guiding us on this journey. We're starting with this variety that's dry bean. It's called Beefy Resilient Grex, that was bred by Carol Deppy. It's a cross between a tepary bean and a common bean. So we made some selections last year, some single plant selections that we'll be planting out in our next to our plot this year. Dry farmed orchard systems. We just had a session at the Small Farms Conference that brought in three farmers that have dry farmed orchards. And there's also a story of mentorship there, where one farmer mentored another, and then that farmer mentored another farmer. So the story of knowledge transfer, I think, is really intriguing. We haven't been focusing on dry farming in academia because it's not a yield maximization strategy. This knowledge has been transferred farmer to farmer, so it has a rich history that way. Hugelkultur is another topic of interest, which is burying wood that rots in the soil and then planting on top of that, and over time you get a lot of microbial activity that increases water holding capacity. So some farmers are experimenting with that. We haven't included that in our main trials, but this is something that the growers are experimenting with, as well as different types of mulching. And then, you know, the list goes on. I mean, there's a lot of people doing their own experimentation of what might work on their site. This is a field that had a lot of bindweed pressure. Do any of you all have bindweed pressure in your with your vegetable growers or in your fields? So we do too. Bindweed loves dry farming. Doesn't mind it at all. It has like roots that are, who knows, like go to the center of the earth perhaps. But this farmer was managing that with weed fabric. This is his melon field. So that was really working well for him. So this is just where you can find some more information about our project. The Dry Farming Collaborative is on Facebook, so anybody who's interested in learning more of what these growers are doing is welcome to join our Facebook group. And then my email address is there if you'd like to contact me afterwards.